I moved into my new apartment in the suburbs of Chicago in late October 2019. The building was old. The walls were terrifyingly thin. I could hear my neighbor in apartment 4B clearly. I never saw him. He was silent all day. But at 3 a.m., everything would start. I would hear a sharp scratching sound on the shared wall between us. It sounded like human fingernails trying to claw through the concrete. Then, a faint singing would begin. It was a series of low-frequency hums that made my window glass vibrate. One night, I pressed my ear against the wall. I heard a voice whisper my name from the other side. "George, we know you're listening." The blood froze in my veins. How did he know my name? I hadn't met anyone on this floor. I looked through the peephole into the hallway. The hallway was pitch black. Suddenly I saw the doorknob of apartment 4B turn slowly. The door opened just an inch. A single eye appeared from inside. It had no white in it. It was completely black and shined with a dim light. I backed away and fell to the floor. I heard a muffled laugh coming from behind the wall. The smell of sulfur and rotting garbage began to leak from under the door. I called the landlord in the morning. He told me with a trembling voice that apartment 4B had been abandoned for 5 years. He told me the last tenant was found dead while trying to dig through the wall with his bare fingers. I didn't believe him at first. I thought it was just a story to scare me. But that night, I heard heavy footsteps inside my apartment. The footsteps were coming from the kitchen. I walked slowly with a knife in my hand. I found no one, but I found scratches on my kitchen wall. They looked like the scratches I heard every night. They formed a single sentence. "We have carved our way to you." I felt a sudden coldness behind my neck. It was as if someone was standing right behind me, breathing quietly. I didn't dare to turn around. Things started to get out of control in a physical and tangible way. I woke up the next day and found black bruises on my ankles. It was as if a strong hand had pulled me while I was sleeping. The mirrors in my apartment started showing a permanent layer of fog, even if the air was dry. I began to see shadows moving in the corners of my eyes. When I turned, they disappeared quickly. I decided to put a security camera in the living room. The next night, I heard nothing. I felt relieved for a few seconds, but when I checked the recording in the morning, I wished I hadn't. The video showed a tall, thin figure coming out of the shared wall with apartment 4B. It didn't come through the door. It came out of the solid wall as if it were made of liquid smoke. The entity was wearing tattered clothes from the last century. It stood over my bed for 4 continuous hours. It didn't move an inch. It tilted its head left and right slowly. In the video, the entity suddenly leaned down and whispered in my ear while I was asleep. At that moment in the recording, the power in my apartment went out. I heard the sound of glass shattering in the bathroom. I ran there. I found the mirror completely smashed. The shards were arranged on the floor to form a circle. In the middle of the circle, there was an old, rusty key. It was the key to the neighboring apartment. Suddenly, the walls started bleeding a sticky black liquid. The pictures hanging on the wall began to flip upside down. I heard a collective screaming coming from behind the wall. It wasn't the scream of one person. It was the screams of dozens. It was as if the neighboring apartment contained a prison for tortured spirits. I tried to get out of my apartment door, but the handle was hot enough to burn. I was trapped. Voices began to pierce my mind directly. "Open the door, George. They want to come back. You are the required sacrifice." I started to feel invisible fingers wrapping around my neck. I began to lose consciousness slowly. Darkness crawled from under the walls of the neighboring apartment to cover my entire world. I gathered all my strength and broke the living room window with a wooden chair. The cold wind rushed in and shattered the cursed silence. I looked down. I was on the 4th floor. Falling meant death, but staying meant something much worse. At that moment, the shared wall opened completely. There was no wall anymore. I saw apartment 4B clearly. It wasn't an apartment. It was an infinite void of darkness. I saw hundreds of pale faces hanging in the air. Their eyes were sewn shut with black thread. The old tenant was standing in the middle. His fingernails were long and broken. He waved his hand at me and invited me to enter. Gravity in my room began to collapse. The furniture started flying towards that black void. I clung to the window frame until my fingers bled. I felt a cold hand grab my foot and try to pull me inside. It was the hand of the entity I saw on the camera. I let out a scream that tore my throat. I remembered the rusty key I found. I threw it with all my strength into the black void. As soon as the key touched that darkness, there was an explosion of white light. The void suddenly shrank as if it were a black hole, closing on itself. I fell hard onto my apartment floor. The wall went back to how it was, but it was covered in ash. I ran toward the door, and it opened this time. I didn't look back. I ran down the stairs and jumped into my car. I drove for miles without stopping. When I reached a distant motel, I looked in the car mirror. I screamed in horror. It wasn't my hair that had gone gray. Instead, there were tiny scratches under the skin of my face. They formed microscopic words. "We live inside you now." I never went back to that apartment. I learned later that the building burned down completely an hour after I left. They found no trace of bodies, and they found no trace of apartment 4B in the original building plans. I now live in a mobile home in the middle of the desert. I stay away from any shared walls, but on quiet nights I still hear the scratching sound. It's not from the wall this time. It's from inside my chest, as if something is trying to dig its way out from between my ribs. And worst of all, I've started smiling in the mirror with a smile that doesn't belong to me, the smile of my neighbor whom I never met. If you have ever driven alone at 3 a.m. on American highways, you know the feeling of being completely disconnected from the rest of the human world. Your car becomes your only bubble of protection from the unknown. I was driving my old sedan back to my dorm in Washington State. It was right after Thanksgiving break. It was a cold and lonely night in late November. The rain was slamming hard against the windshield. Visibility was almost zero. I made a very stupid decision. I took a detour to avoid a massive pileup that shut down the main interstate. My GPS directed me onto an old back road through thick forests. This was the worst idea of my entire life. The road was darker than I can describe. Giant pine trees stood like suffocating black wolves on both sides. No street lights, no houses. Cell service had vanished over an hour ago. I was listening to the radio at a very low volume to ease the tension. Suddenly, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. Headlights appeared out of nowhere. They were following me from a distance. At first, I didn't think much of it. It's normal for other drivers to take the same shortcut. But after 20 minutes, anxiety started creeping into my heart. The car kept a perfectly constant distance behind me. It never tried to speed up or pass. I slowed down significantly to test the driver. The car behind slowed down immediately by the same amount. I floored it and sped up suddenly. The car responded in a split second and matched my speed. They were intentionally staying behind me like a shadow. My heart began to race, and pound against my chest. I looked closely in the mirror despite the glare. It was a large, black, lifted truck. The windshield was completely tinted. I couldn't see the driver's face at all. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting because of exhaustion. Maybe it was just a tired trucker using my lights to guide him through the rain. But things took a terrifying turn. The truck killed its headlights completely. The road behind me became a void of pitch-black darkness, but I knew for a fact they were still there. I could hear the roar of the massive engine blending with the thunder and rain. They were following me in total darkness using only my red taillights. This is not normal behavior. This is the behavior of someone hiding. This is the behavior of a predator stalking its prey. I felt an icy chill run down my spine. I wanted to call the police. I pulled out my phone with a shaking hand. I looked at the screen. It said, "No service," in a cold, dead font. I was completely alone in the heart of these woods. No one in the world knew where I was. No one would hear me scream. I decided to drive as fast as I could. I hoped to reach a gas station or a small town. But the road was getting worse and full of sharp turns. And then, the worst happened. The truck flicked its lights back on, but this time, they turned on high-intensity light bars. The light blinded me in the mirrors. They were closing in at a terrifying speed. The distance between us was less than a yard. They were tailgating me so hard, I thought they would push me off the road. I struggled to focus on the asphalt. I could barely breathe. I realized then that this was personal. Fear paralyzed my logical thinking. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The rain was getting violent. The truck started honking its horn in short, aggressive bursts. The sound was loud and deep. It sounded like a metallic laugh echoing through the forest. I made a desperate move to survive. I saw a narrow dirt path branching off to the right. I killed my own lights suddenly to lose them. I swerved hard into the hidden trail. I almost lost control and flipped. The tires skidded in deep mud. I flicked my lights back on once I was deep in the trees. I checked the mirror. The truck didn't follow. I saw its red brake lights continue down the main road until they vanished. I let out a long breath. A massive wave of relief hit my body. I parked in total darkness between the trees. I killed the engine. I sat in absolute silence. I only heard the heavy rain hitting the roof. I really thought I outsmarted them. I thought the nightmare was over. I was wrong. Dead wrong. The real nightmare hadn't even started. I sat frozen in my seat for about half an hour. I was trying to catch my breath. I was trying to think of a way out. The air inside the car became freezing and stale. The windows started to fog up from my heavy breathing. I wiped a small spot on the windshield. The darkness outside was heavy. It was like a physical entity surrounding me. I couldn't see anything past a few feet. The forest was dead silent except for the rain. I finally decided it was safer to head back to the main road. I assumed the truck was long gone. I put my shaking hand on the key. I turned it. The engine made a weak, hollow sound. It wouldn't start. My stomach dropped. I tried again. Same result. The engine was choking. I knew the battery was fine before this trip. Something was preventing the engine from running on purpose. I tried over and over as panic began to eat my mind. Suddenly, the dirt path behind me lit up. It wasn't a car. It was high-powered flashlights. I looked in the mirror. My eyes widened in pure terror. I saw 3 people walking slowly toward my car. They were wearing long, shiny black raincoats. Their faces were not visible. They were covered by simple, white plastic masks. They didn't run. They didn't scream. They walked in sync, calm, calculated. That calm was scarier than any violent attack. I hit the lock buttons on all the doors. I made sure every window was rolled up. The three figures stopped about 6 feet behind my car. They just stood there like statues. The flashlights were aimed directly at my face through the mirror. I held up my hands to block the blinding white light. Time moved so slowly. It was agonizing. After minutes of this silence, one of them moved. He walked toward my driver's side window. He was very tall and bulky. He stood right next to the glass. He looked at me through the mask. He didn't try to break the window. He didn't pull the handle. He just stood there. He pulled a modern smartphone from his pocket. He turned on the camera flash and started recording. He was filming me trapped in my metal cage. He was documenting my fear. He was filming the tears on my face. I was screaming at the top of my lungs. I was slamming the glass from the inside. He had no reaction. A second person moved to the front of the car. He climbed onto the hood. He sat there cross-legged right in front of my eyes. He stared at me through the windshield. The third person stayed in the back, keeping the flashlight on me. They were playing a sadistic psychological game. I realized these weren't robbers. Real robbers work fast. These people were feeding on my terror. The person by my window started tapping on the glass. One loud tap, then a pause, then another. Tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic and slow. I felt my mind snapping. This wasn't a movie. This was real human evil. They were in total control of my life. Suddenly the tapping stopped. The person on the hood reached into his coat. He pulled out a small, flat envelope. He leaned forward and tucked it under my windshield wiper. Then he hopped off the hood. He joined the others. All at once they killed their flashlights. The darkness swallowed them whole. I was alone again. I sat there in the silence. My heart was hurting from the stress. I could only hear the rain and the echo of that tapping in my head. I didn't move for a long time. I was afraid it was a trap. I thought they were still there in the dark. The silence lasted too long. I gathered every bit of courage I had left. I flicked on the interior light for a split second. I wanted to see what he left on the glass. It was a small brown envelope. Just seeing it made me feel sick. I realized I couldn't stay in these woods until morning. I would die of cold or a heart attack. I decided to try the engine one last time. I closed my eyes. I prayed. I turned the key with everything I had. Miraculously, the engine coughed and roared to life. I didn't waste a millisecond. I slammed the gas. The car jumped forward through the mud. I didn't look back. I didn't care about the road. I just wanted asphalt. I hit the main highway and took off. I drove like a lunatic. I didn't care about the rain or the speed limit. I was running for my life. 2 hours later, I saw lights. It was a small 24-hour gas station. I swerved in and stopped at the front door. I ran inside, leaving my car door open. I was soaking wet and shaking. I begged the old clerk to call the police. I told him everything in broken sentences. While we waited for the cops, I felt a fake sense of safety. I remembered the envelope. I went out for a second to grab it. I wanted to give it to the police as evidence. I pulled it from under the wiper. It was damp from the rain. I went back inside and opened it with trembling hands. It wasn't a death threat. It wasn't a weird symbol. It was a single photograph, a Polaroid. I flipped it over. My heart stopped. All the blood drained from my face. My knees buckled. The photo wasn't of me in the woods. The photo was of me sleeping in my own bed. My bed in my locked dorm room. The angle showed the person was standing right next to my pillow, looking down at me while I was unconscious. and the date written at the bottom in black ink was from last Tuesday. Days before my trip, I realized the horrific truth. The woods weren't a random encounter. They didn't find me by chance. They had been watching me for a long time. They knew where I lived. They knew how I slept. The truck wasn't chasing me. It was herding me into their trap. The police arrived, but I knew they couldn't help. The clerk was talking to the officer, but I couldn't hear them. I just stood there staring through the glass at the dark woods. I know they are out there right now, standing in the trees, watching me from the shadows, smiling under those white masks. The night in the woods wasn't the end. It was just the intro. The game has just begun, and they have the keys to my entire life. I was never the type to flinch at stories of haunted houses. I used to think the ancient forests of West Virginia hid nothing more than hungry bears or the occasional drifter running from the law, until that night. That was the night I decided, driven by a cursed curiosity, to challenge the well of bones that sat behind the ruins of my grandfather's farm, abandoned since the 70s. The air that night was unnervingly heavy, its thickness resembling the texture of clotted blood. The deeper I ventured into the trees, the more my wristwatch began to spin backward frantically, its hands groaning with a sharp metallic screech, as if time itself was refusing my entry into that desecrated place. When I reached the stone opening, I heard no wind, no rustling of leaves. Instead, a funerary silence prevailed, broken only by the sound of heavy, wet, rhythmic breathing coming from the gut of the well, as if the earth beneath my feet were giant lungs exhaling pus. A stench of rot wafted up that I had never smelled before. It was a suffocating cocktail of sulfur and the scent of human flesh left to slowly decompose in an eternal, sunless damp. I stood on the crumbling edge, feeling every cell in my body screaming at me to back away, but hidden forces were pulling me to look down. I clicked on my flashlight, and instead of seeing water, I saw a darkness moving like coils of snakes. When the surface settled for a moment, I looked at my reflection, but it wasn't my face that stared back. I saw a creature that looked like me in every detail, but it was peeling the skin off its face with long fingernails, slowly and sadistically, its eyes completely gouged out and emitting a faint red glow. That abomination looked at me, and its torn lips began to move, whispering in a shattered voice that sounded like bones grinding together. "You're very late, Ethan. The table is set down below, and you are the main course we've been waiting for." At that moment, I felt cold drops of sweat turn to ice on my forehead, and I realized I was no longer alone in that forest. That curiosity had led me to my inevitable doom. While I was trying to process the sight of my distorted face below, I suddenly felt a cold that no human description could ever convey. A cold that didn't just pierce my leather boots, but one I felt gnawing at my ankle bones like blades made of black ice. I looked beneath my feet, and that's when I fell into the first stages of madness. The solid ground around the mouth of the well was gone. The soil and tree roots had turned into a black, gelatinous substance, liquid like oil and thick like tar, beginning to swallow my feet with a calculated slowness. I tried to scream, opening my mouth to plead to the heavens, but no sound came out. My throat had been replaced by a cold void, and my scream emerged as the hiss of a dying snake. That cursed place had robbed me of my right to cry for help. Suddenly, the water at the bottom of the well began to boil without heat, rising with a terrifying speed that defied every law of physics we know. The water didn't overflow like a normal liquid. It was shaping itself as it rose, like a dough made of tortured souls. From within that blackness, hundreds of thin, unnaturally long hands began to emerge, arms stretching for meters, revealing broken joints protruding from beneath transparent skin that dripped a caustic green fluid, melting the stone. One of these entities raised its head slowly toward my face. It had no lower jaw. Instead, there was a black void leaking viscous saliva and a cleft tongue that extended like a whip to lick the edge of the well, searching for my flesh. In a moment of absolute despair, I gathered my strength and threw a large stone I had picked up from the ground, thinking I might disrupt this crawl. But what happened shattered my mind. The stone didn't fall. As soon as it entered the perimeter of the well's mouth, it stopped mid-air as if gravity had ceased to exist. Then the stone spun around, its speed doubling as it ricocheted back toward my forehead with a force that crushed my skin and splattered my blood onto the ancient stones. In that moment, I realized the bitter truth. Gravity inside the circle of the well was working in reverse. I had become the target bottom, and the well had become the dark sky into which I would fall, plummeting upward toward where they lived. The hands were closing in, the sound of their bony nails clicking against the stone deafening me, and every single hand bore a name etched into its skin. And I saw my name slowly forming on the palm of the one closest to me. In that harrowing moment, he emerged from the mouth of the well. The entity that still haunts my nightmares and makes me wake up screaming in the middle of every night. He wasn't a physical body in the traditional sense, but a massive mass of concentrated darkness with no clear features. Yet his body was composed of thousands of miniature human faces, moving and seething beneath his translucent skin, faces opening and closing their mouths in a silent, piercing scream. He dug his talons, which looked like blades carved from ancient human bone, into my left shoulder. I felt the true cold of death spread through my veins like a potent venom, freezing my blood on its way to my heart. He began pulling me toward the opening with an irresistible force. In those seconds that felt like eons, I saw the true hell at the bottom. There was no water, but infinite rooms built from the bones of the victims who came before me, and the muffled screams of thousands of people whom no one had ever heard of, swimming in an ocean of eternal agony. The entity's face drew closer to mine. He had no eyes, only two black pits echoing a very distant scream. I felt my soul being pulled from between my ribs as if a giant magnet below was ripping out my essence, while the entity dragged me with calculated slowness toward the edge of the well to make me part of that tortured herd. And under the weight of pain that made my mind shatter into 1,000 pieces, my trembling hand accidentally touched an old iron pendant that belonged to my grandfather. They said it was forged from meteoric iron that fell on this land centuries ago. At that moment, I screamed from the depths of my being with every prayer and every holy incantation I knew. A scream that didn't come from my mouth but from the very core of my existence. Suddenly, the earth shook beneath us as if an earthquake had struck all of Slaughter's Valley. A faint blue light exploded from my pendant, not as a grace or a miracle, but like a violent chemical reaction between the matter of my living soul and the filth of that desecrated entity. The abomination let out a shriek that wasn't heard by ears, but felt in the skull as if it were about to explode, and it fell back into the depths, making a sound like the shattering of hundreds of mirrors all at once. I took off running, not looking back at anything. The forest behind me was twisting and snarling, the tree branches turning into giant limbs, trying to drag me down and pull me back. I reached my house crawling on my hands and knees. The hair you see on me now didn't turn white from age. It went gray on that cursed night. I am no longer the Ethan people used to know. I lost the ability to speak for months, and even today, I cannot look into any reflective surface or go near a glass of water, because I know for a fact that the thing that came back from those woods isn't entirely me. A part of my soul is still screaming there at the bottom of the well of bones, waiting for a new victim to trade places with. So be careful, son, for the door is still cracked open, and the hunger below never ends.